Welcome to the Surviving to Thriving podcast with Jim Squire. I'm a licensed psychotherapist here in Toronto, Canada, and the title of this episode is Understanding Shame. Shame is one of the areas that shows up quite frequently in the work that I do. I think it permeates through almost everyone's life to some degree, and one of the challenges with it is not typically acknowledged. And so we're going to delve a bit into why that is and why working through shame is so difficult. So one of the things about shame is that it's often intermixed with fear. The shame is often, I describe it as sort of on top of the fear because it has such a relevance for our survival. Why I think it's very important to talk about shame is that it drives behavior, impacts relationships, has a lot to do with societal norms. We live in societies where shame has so much impact on us in terms of suffering, and so much of the struggle that individuals have is, I believe, related to shame wounds, typically that came or developed when they were young. So what is shame? Shame is obviously an emotion, but it's a little different than the sort of primary emotions. We would call it a self-conscious emotion. And what we mean by that is where something like fear or sadness would just appear. Shame it involves some awareness of self and self-evaluation. Typically, I will explain to people that if you think about shame, and I sometimes refer to it as a sort of a social emotion in a sense, because if I lived on a mountain somewhere and nobody was around and I did something and no one could witness that, I could potentially, feel some shame if it violated my values, but it's unlikely that it would be difficult. Whereas when you look at how shame normally is triggered, the amount of people that witness the thing that I've done that triggers the shame will impact the degree of the shame. It'll, if I make a huge mistake in front of 100 people or 1,000 people, it's generally going to be more impactful than one person, unless that person is like my partner or someone that's super close to me. So it has a lot to do with how we were raised, our societal standards, the way we perceive things, what's acceptable, what's not acceptable. And also we want to say that the self-conscious emotions depend on our capacity to evaluate self, and we're looking at external judgments. So I often use this phrase that really, I think, encapsulates the nature of shame, because shame and guilt are similar but very different in a sense in terms of their impact. So I often phrase it this way, that it's a common way of phrasing it, that guilt tells us we made a mistake, shame tells us we are the mistake. And so there's a big distinction there between the same mistake could have happened to two people. One might have had a healthy response of like, oh, I shouldn't do that again, or I should learn not to do that again. Whereas the shame would maybe then, with the other person that's feeling shame, it would internalize, they'd feel less than, worthless, inadequate, something to do with their person. So we're looking at an external, like there's something I've done is wrong in guilt, versus shame that there is something wrong with me. And therein lies the problem, why we need to work on it. And it's so important is that it becomes part of the person's identity. And children that have experienced quite a bit of shame due to the way parents typically parent, or even some other experiences like bullying and that, will then grow up with it as part of their identity. So in terms of an evolutionary lens that we look through this, shame is an adaptive mechanism to keep us in good standing with our group or tribe. If you think about it, especially if we were in smaller groups, shame would be something that would make sure that I would conform and perform within the group in a way that would lead to my success as a person. If I was with a group or a tribe and I didn't do that, I would be unlikely that I would be perceived positively, find a mate, etc. So it makes a lot of sense that it is an adaptive mechanism. It tends to signal the risk of social rejection, of course, of what we're saying, which historically would mean danger to your survival. If I was living in a tribe or a group hundreds of years ago and I was thrown out of that group, it would certainly impact my survival. I would probably, likely in most cases, wouldn't survive. So one of the other perspectives we look at is the neurobiological perspective. So in terms of what happens to people, it's activating the limbic system, especially the amygdala, and which is connected to threat responses, which is connected to things like fight or flight. I sometimes characterize shame as the most difficult, uncomfortable emotional experience. Some people would say that sadness and grief might be worse, but it's just feels awful, and that's how I usually describe it. Most people can relate to that. It's just there's such a heaviness in the body. It just feels awful, and I think that's obviously connected to the fact that, it's telling me there's something wrong with Jim, or something wrong with who I am, and I don't measure up. I'm inadequate. I'm not going to succeed like other people. I don't have what it takes like other people. There's so many variations of this. So the other way to look at it too is that shame tends to overlap with the fight, flight, and freeze response. So it can we bring what we call collapse, withdrawal, and hiding. So that's one of the things I often point out to clients is you can always tell, even if you don't know that's what you're feeling, if you have this desire to hide or to pull away or to just be by yourself. And with a lot of people, couples even I work with, they'll have a disagreement and one person will want to go to the bedroom, shut the door, be by themselves. And they're often then sort of feeling shame. They may not necessarily notice that, but it's certainly driving this need to pull away. So if it makes sense when you think about it, if I pull away from everyone that can perceive what I'm doing, then I won't have any more, I won't trigger more shame, won't have someone evaluating my behavior, my actions, etc., which is where shame is coming from. So what are the roots of shame? So typically in the work that I do, we're finding the roots of shame in childhood. I believe strongly through the way that I work that the early wounds of shame are then re-triggered at older ages. And so there's initial shame wounds from usually under 10 years old that we try to work on. So in terms of like the childhood experiences that will trigger a lot of shame, repeated messages of not being enough, very critical parents, parents that say things like, it's very easy to shame children. Why are you, when I was young, they would say things like, oh, you're a sissy, or you're not as good as this other person, or all the other people are better than you, and things like that. I even had a situation with my son when he was in middle school where his teacher, which wasn't that long ago, shamed him because he missed a day and brought in a note from me saying why he had been late. And the teacher decided to read the note out to the whole class saying, oh, Jaden has a note from his father, almost like in a joking way. And so this was obviously a way to shame him, which unfortunately the biggest problem with this is it really does work well with conditioning behavior. If you shame a child, it's unlikely, there's a good chance they won't do that again. It's just extremely unhealthy because this is part of what contributes to them getting older and then identifying themselves through this lens of shame. When they may hide it quite well when they're older, but when they get triggered, when something happens, it'll come back to, I'm not good enough, I'm less than, inadequate, something like that. So trauma, of course, neglect and love that's conditional, which is tied to performance, and obedience can lead to shame. Of course, when you don't meet those standards. Certainly the thing to understand about a young child is they don't have a lot of awareness. So they're going to look at things. So if I have a dysfunctional father who is constantly yelling at me and hurting me and mistreating me or neglecting me, it could be either parent, I'm not going to think, oh, he needs therapy, there's something wrong with him when I'm 6 years old. I'm going to think there's something wrong with me. Now, the other thing that's helpful for children to do, and it may not sound helpful, is that if they look at their caregivers who they rely on for survival as dysfunctional in some level, even though they wouldn't use that word, then what's going to happen to their survival? The people that I'm counting on to survive are not are dysfunctional, unhealthy. Then what's going to happen to me? So it would make sense the child would then be easier for them to say, as the child, I'm the problem. And that would feel safer from a survival perspective. And so I think that kind of helps explain why shame is so prevalent when kids are young. They're also typically in that young age in what we call the egocentric stage. So everything is about them. So not having friends, different things happening in their life, parents being overwhelmed with work and not spending time with them, different things like that happening will lead to the child then saying, well, why don't I have friends? What's wrong with me? Why don't my parents spend time with me? All these kinds of things. They won't have an awareness of the bigger picture in a sense. So there's also a lot of intergenerational transmission. I certainly experienced this with my kids who were little, with grandparents kind of shaming them. I remember my son was tearing up one day, and his grandmother said to him that, what are you, a sissy or a crybaby? And of course that would be an example of shaming a child. Typically today, in this day and age, people aren't doing things like that. But, that was something I share a lot with people, that and my son instantly stopped crying. So it was very, if the person was trying to curve behavior, it was very effective, but obviously unhealthy. Now, if that's going to happen once or twice when he's a child, it's not going to, lead to him having identity around shame, of course. I never did that, raising him in a sense. But just to give it a sense of that, a lot of people from the earlier generations just don't have this knowledge. They don't know what should you do or not do. They're very focused on compliance, obedience, and being good, that type of thing, regardless of what sort of damage it may do. I don't think they typically are aware of that. So, shame passed down through family patterns. They're not talking. We're not allowed to express certain emotions. Not trusting. These types of things can be passed along. In terms of how shame shows up in our daily life, it's very connected to our inner critic. Our inner critic is often that voice in our head that's criticizing us, attacking us, pointing out our flaws, sense of being, unworthy or flawed, or it often yells at us and is very critical with us because it's not wanting us to do something to interfere with our survival, basically. So the way it shows up typically in relationships would be withdrawal. Shame gets triggered, person shuts down, pulls away, defensiveness. Typically shame will have this pattern that we see often with anger, where the person feels the shame and then the anger quickly comes in to push the shame out so they can cope better. Anger is a much easier emotion to cope with rather than something like shame. I think about anger, you have power, you feel energized, you feel powerful when you're angry, where shame would have the complete opposite experience. So the other way that we would see it show up as a couples therapist, I see this a lot, is someone saying, I love you, saying positive things to you, and you then feel like you reject them because of these internal shame wounds. You feel less than, inadequate, so you reject, you may wonder why a person is telling you they love you so much. It doesn't make sense to you. These are the types of things that typically people are working through in therapy. So it leads a lot to certain behaviors like social comparison, not trying to be, position yourself within your group in a certain way. It certainly leads to a lot of toxic work experiences because people are triggered and they're feeling threatened in some way, feeling inadequate. If someone on their team is doing better than them, that kind of thing can really lead them to have a very negative, toxic work environment. So some of the other perspectives on shame, Brene Brown, if you're familiar with her, has done a lot of work on shame and has for many years. I think she initially started doing some work in a separate area and ended up like just focusing a lot on shame. She found it very interesting and very rewarding to work on. One of the things she talks a lot about is the link between shame and perfectionism, which I don't think a lot of people don't connect those two. Typically, the shame will drive a person to feel like they have to be the best, they have to be perfect, they can't make mistakes, because the shame is kind of, as she would describe it, it's lurking there in the background. So in the therapy model that I use, internal family systems, as I mentioned earlier, we would look at shame as these exiles or these burdens of unworthiness that we carry that are pushed away, kind of like buried, basically, so the person can function. And part of the work with the internal family system is to heal those. So in attachment theory, shame is kind of triggered when a disruption happens in a bond, rejection, things like that. These are very obvious, very common triggers for shame. Someone rejects me. Very easy to feel like, something wrong with me. I don't measure up. I'm not good enough, etc. So in terms of the other perspectives around shame, we could look at shame as a regulator of morality and social norms. It kind of helps groups stay cohesive in a sense. The people don't want to feel shame, so they conform. There's different cultures that have different challenges around shame. I might just give a couple here that, as I said, social order can be maintained by the threat of shame, losing face, being dishonored, disgraced. It's certainly something that most people would not want to go through. Fear of public exposure, social exclusion. Person's identity is then connected to a certain group. They're going to be pushed out of the group. Concepts in the sort of traditional Japanese culture, shame is very prevalent. There's this idea of duty and obligation as well. So losing honor brings shame, not only to the individual, but also to the family or the group. So therein even increasing the heightening of the experience. Not only are you going to shame yourself, but you shame your whole family by doing something. In ancient Greece, they did have this view, and in Homer's Iliad, they actually talk about how warriors feared shame more than death, which I think makes perfect sense. Many collectivist societies, belonging in social harmony outweigh individual guilt or individual needs. Certain cultures focus a lot on guilt. People, certainly Christian-influenced Western societies, there was a lot of focus on sin, confession, forgiveness. Guilt is heavily emphasized, and shame also is very intertwined with that as well. It's a bit different in terms of like the Western societies in terms of there's much more of an emphasis on individual responsibility, not so much in the group or the family. Certainly Jewish and Islamic traditions focus on accountability before God more than, I think, social standards for the group. So there's lots of different ways that this shows up. Years ago, I had an office in a church, and I worked with a lot of Christian clients, and a lot of the early experience they had with the church, and a lot of the early, when they were a child, the early messages they received around sex, and even certain thoughts and feelings and things that would come up in those areas triggered a lot of shame for them. There was a lot of pornography use, a lot of shame, a lot of hiding, of course, because if I was to admit what I'm doing, I'd be rejected, etc. So I think almost every male I worked with years ago in that setting was struggling with shame or pornography on some level. So I got to give an overview here of shame and fairly detailed perspective on shame. But I want to talk a bit about like healing now in terms of shame. So one of the things we like to do is notice when it's being triggered. Try to notice where you're feeling it in the body. Try to, rather than experience it and feel it's true, understand it's like an old shame wound or shame being triggered, understand why it's happening. There's a saying I have with my clients that shame is a lie, and what I mean by that is that it is telling them that they're inadequate, unworthy, less than. And I don't believe that's true. I don't believe anyone is, but that's the story that shame is telling them. So that's why I kind of phrase it that way. Self-compassion is so important to shame because a lot of that was missing typically when you were younger. So cultivating warmth towards yourself, making sure you're connected is so key, because shame will push you towards isolation. Relational healing, having safe connections, having groups, a lot of even men participate in groups where they can talk about the pressures and the shame and the need to be a certain way in society or in their families, and having to always perform or show up, lest they don't feel like they end up feeling shame. Vulnerability is often something that's really difficult for people with shame, so needing to work towards being able to feel vulnerable. So reframing shame's role is very helpful in therapy, from something awful that's showing up to just more of a signal to, as we would do in IFES, we need to heal certain parts. The shame wounds are being triggered. It really does help the person sort of like look at it differently. If you think about a person that triggers and thinks, oh my God, I'm unworthy, I'm inadequate, I can't seem to do this, is very different from a person noticing a shame wound being triggered when something happens, and then being able to understand, okay, I need to work through this or get some tools to work through this. And I don't normally do this in the podcast, but I thought I would try it in this podcast. I want to give a little exercise to you, the listeners, so you can kind of get a sense of what I'm talking about. So I want you to recall a moment whenever in your life, you could be a child, something could have been recent, where you felt shame. And visualize that moment or that experience where you felt shame. And I want you to try to notice where you feel it in your body, wherever it shows up. Maybe you feel it. Typically, I notice shame often shows up in the upper chest or the bottom of the throat or the neck. It may just kind of a heaviness there. Could show up in your stomach. Could be anywhere. The point is to kind of focus on where it's showing up and try to just focus on offering some kindness and love and warmth and compassion to that part of you. And if you want to explore it even further, you could ask that part some questions. You could say, what is it afraid of? I understand what's going on with it. Generally, if you try to open this dialogue, you'll get a response. I know some people may find this unusual. They've never done something like this before, but at the very least, figure out where you feel shame in your body. Notice where it shows up. It'll always show up in the same way. And then that way, it'll help you have more of a body awareness around the experience, so that when you're triggered, oh gosh, that's shame. I'm feeling this heaviness in my upper chest and my throat is shame again. Because sometimes people don't necessarily clue into what's going on. So give that a try. In closing, I want to just say that shame is typically universal. Everyone feels it. It can be deeply rooted and very hard to work through. If you need to work through it and your own efforts are not working, seek out a therapist that has worked with trauma, worked with shame. I think internal family systems is wonderful, but there are many ways to work through shame. Have hope, stay connected, have some compassion for yourself. Those things are really key. And just increase your awareness around it. If, as I'm talking about shame, your immediate reaction is that you don't have it or it's not an issue, I kind of encourage you to go deeper with that, because people are quite defensive and resistant when you bring up the idea that they're feeling shame. Although I typically find if I say, do you feel inadequate or less than, they'll often agree to that. But if I say, I think that's shame, they'll often say no and reject it and be defensive. So if you're rejecting it when you hear me speak about it, give yourself some time to reflect. And, we all have gone through that, especially when we're young. We all have those really difficult experiences in the playground with our parents. And I find too, when our first experiences often are so powerful because we don't have any awareness. The first, girl that rejected me, the first time I tried to play with some kids and they told me that, we don't want you playing with us, you're no good. Things like that. And when I was very young, I was an overweight child, and so I was, picked on because I was overweight. I was shunned or made fun of because I was overweight. And those are terrible experiences for a child and lead to shame. So I thank you for being here. Certainly, if you have any comments or anything to add to this, I'd love to hear from you. Send me a message, make comments on social media, wherever works for you.